Paint me a landscape, desolate, forbidding, yet starkly beautiful. In the foreground, sketch a line of barren, rubble-strewn hills, rising from a vast plain dotted sparsely with the primitive dwellings of a downtrodden people, hovering on the brink of survival. Little grows here without human intervention, and those who endure this rigorous climate reflect its asperity, their skins weathered and darkened by exposure to cruel winds and a merciless sun. In the distance, outline a towering range of jagged mountains crowned with snow and ice, soaring into a brilliant sky, azure near the horizon, ultraviolet overhead. This is the land of Tibet, the world's highest plateau, an Arctic desert nearly 3 miles above sea level with an area twice the size of Texas. It and the vast Himalaya forming its southern boundary are evolving even now, as the titanic forces of plate tectonics drive the northward drifting Indian plate into the relatively stationary Eurasian plate, creating topographic chaos where they collide. On another canvas, paint a scene eloquent of fertility, with verdant hills bursting with the crops nearing harvest, and peppered with the stone houses of a friendly people, whose cheerful dispositions belie their poverty. Above and beyond, looming over this bucolic scene like a phalanx of giant sentinels, are the same snow-capped peaks which define the common border with neighboring Tibet to the north. This is the Kingdom of Nepal, occupying an area about 1/10 that of its neighbor, and while many of its inhabitants share ethnic and religious roots with their counterparts in Tibet, their governments, politics, and mental attitudes are as dissimilar as their topographies. Our presentation tonight, while driven by mountaineering, highlights the people, culture, and geography of two contiguous countries worlds apart despite their proximity. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll traverse deserts and mountains, swim with elephants in crocodile-infested jungle rivers, explore labyrinthine streets in Kathmandu where colorful markets inhabit every bustling crossroads, and tour Lhasa's sprawling Potala Palace and other temples and monasteries on both sides of the Himalaya. Our kaleidoscopic journey will take us from teeming cities on the verge of modernization to primitive hinterlands scarcely touched by it, and finally to mountaintops, far removed from the comforts of home where we test our mettle against the elements in an exhilarating but hostile environment. Our adventure begins in Nepal, a country whose varied topography encompasses a vertical relief unequaled anywhere else on Earth. From the steaming jungles and fertile plains of the southern Terai near sea level, the country slopes sharply upward in a northerly direction to the hills and valleys of central Nepal, and then ever more steeply to the mighty barrier wall of the Himalaya, whose highest summits, including 29,000-foot Mount Everest, delineate the border with Tibet. Rectangular in shape, the country spans a distance of 500 miles from east to west and 100 miles from north to south, at a latitude roughly equivalent to that of central Florida. Nepal's earliest historical records date to the first millennium BC, documenting interactions between militant kingdoms centered in the valley of Kathmandu. During the ensuing centuries, a steady influx of immigrants from India and Tibet bolstered its population, creating a diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious mix. Thus, its people reflect variously Indo-Aryan and Mongolian physical characteristics, and speak numerous tongues and dialects, although Nepali, a derivative of Sanskrit and similar to Indian Hindi, is the official and by far the most widespread language. While Hinduism is the prevailing religion, Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha and founder of Buddhism, was born in Nepal around the 5th century BC, and variants of his religion are practiced in northern parts of the country. Nepal is among the more densely populated of the world's countries, with 25 million people living within an area slightly smaller than that of our state of Georgia. Throughout much of its history, Nepal was isolated from the rest of the world, reflecting not only the formidable barriers of impenetrable mountains in the north, east, and west, and malaria-infested jungles in the south, but also the reluctance of its people to embrace outsiders. In 1959, following a palace revolt, King Tribhuvan, a member of the Shah family, regained power, overthrowing the autocratic Rana dynasty, which for the preceding 2 centuries had dominated a succession of impotent kings. Tribhuvan opened Nepal's long-sealed borders and initiated a gradual process of democratization, which, however, was not fully realized until his grandson, King Birendra, a graduate of Eton and Harvard, inherited the throne in 1972 and legalized political parties in 1990. But alas, Birendra, his wife, and other family members were recently assassinated in a palace coup, which installed Birendra's brother, Gyanendra, as the new king. Although Nepal's government remains a constitutional monarchy and therefore quasi-democratic, the royal family, one of the world's wealthiest, enjoys ultimate power by virtue of its control of the military and police establishments, and is still viewed favorably by the people despite the recent upheaval. Nevertheless, official corruption, extreme poverty, widespread illiteracy, and a fragmented ethnic and religious population growing explosively all contribute to a fragile political climate. Nepal is about as far from New York as anywhere else on Earth, and flights to it, excluding layovers in Los Angeles and Bangkok, involve 30 hours in the air with ample time for 5 full-length movies and a like number of meals. Descending through broken clouds penetrated by snow-capped Himalayan peaks in the distance, our 747 clears the range of rugged terraced mountains encircling the fertile valley of Kathmandu, a roughly oval basin about 15 miles wide, partitioned into a myriad of tiny farms surrounding the disheveled buildings of the city, from which a miasma of smog now defiles the once pristine atmosphere. Indeed, skyrocketing pollution, both atmospheric and otherwise, has accompanied Kathmandu's burgeoning population, which, currently approaching 700,000, has nearly tripled over the past 20 years. We are met at Kathmandu's Tribhuvan Airport by Ergun Sherpa, who has arranged for a bus to transport us to our hotel. Ergun, a member of the ethnic Sherpa people, all of whom adopt Sherpa as their surname, will be our Sirdar, or local leader, in Nepal and Tibet. A Sirdar's responsibilities involve virtually every aspect of mountaineering in these countries, and it's safe to say that no Himalayan expedition could function efficiently without one. Emerging from the relative calm of the airport, we plunge headlong into the chaos of Kathmandu, our driver deftly maneuvering his bus into a maelstrom of roiling traffic, amidst the clamor of motors, horns, and whistles from a sea of vehicles sharing a single characteristic: total dilapidation. Except for principal thoroughfares near the city's center, most of Kathmandu's roads are unpaved or nearly so, allowing traffic to generate clouds of dust which mix with exhaust fumes in a suffocating combination. We pass through areas of light industry on narrow streets lined with disheveled buildings, many of seemingly recent construction despite an appearance of imminent disintegration. As we approach the center of the city, our road dons pavement and widens as we turn onto Durbar Marg, Kathmandu's most fashionable boulevard, fronted by airline offices, travel agencies, and expensive hotels. Looming ahead is the Royal Palace, surrounded by an imposing 40-foot-high iron fence, belying the royal family's supposed popularity. I pause here to photograph the palace, keeping a wary eye on a nearby guard, armed with a submachine gun standing watch by the main gate. We turn left here and enter Tamel, Kathmandu's mecca of tourism and shopping, where our hotel is located. This colorful district comprises hundreds of crude low buildings densely packed in a haphazard array, their ground floors harboring shops offering a vast array of merchandise ranging from soft drinks, cheap carvings, and sundries to quality indigenous artwork around which tourists haggle with merchants for the best deal. Canned music, chiefly American pop, blares from cheap stereos everywhere, blending discordantly with the general din of traffic noise. Tamel is dissected by a myriad of nameless narrow streets and alleyways, choked with traffic, as motorized vehicles of every description compete with bicycles, rickshaws, and pedestrians for their place in a moving river of humanity. Major intersections harbor the ubiquitous open-air markets devoted primarily to farm products and hardware, which attract large concentrations of natives as well as tourists who, like me, find the photo opportunities irresistible. Walking the streets of Kathmandu can be hazardous. Pedestrians must be alert to avoid hordes of reckless motorcyclists who weave in and out of traffic at warp speed, blowing their horns incessantly, a practice which, according to local custom, mitigates their liability in accidents. Like many third world cities, beggars abound, some soliciting money, others collapsed in the street. But lest this squalor create a false impression, satellite dishes increasingly adorn rooftops, and shops offering internet connections and other computer services are gaining in popularity on those selling Gurkha knives, Tonka paintings, and Himalayan t-shirts. Religion is paramount in the daily lives of the Nepalese. Not surprisingly, this spirituality has over the ages spawned a wealth of spectacular temples, monuments, and sculptures. Religious structures of stunning beauty can be found in the most improbable places, such as this lovely stupa sandwiched between ragtag buildings lining a narrow alleyway in Tamil, or this temple hemmed into the corner of a square housing an open-air market. But Kathmandu's greatest architectural masterpieces may be found in 4 locations: Durbar Square, Swayambhunath, Bodhnath, and Pashupatinath, all of which have been designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Let's now visit them. Durbar Square, located at the crossroads of ancient trading routes, is the cultural and spiritual heart of Kathmandu and the site of one of its oldest buildings, the Kast Mandap, for which the city is named. This structure, nearly 1,000 years old, is constructed entirely of wood, the words Kasta and Mandap meaning wood and platform, respectively. The Durbar Square area comprises about 4 acres of religious and regal structures, including the old royal palace with its 10 courtyards and numerous monuments. It's no longer used by the royal family. Perhaps the most impressive and beautiful structure in the square is the Choyu Temple, rising over 120 feet above the ground on a 12-stage plinth. It's closed to the general public, but may be visited by Hindus once a year during a festival in autumn, or by the royal family anytime. The Temple of Swayambhunath, construction of which began nearly 2,000 years ago, surmounts a hill about a mile west of central Kathmandu. It's also known colloquially as the Monkey Temple, reflecting the large band of macaque monkeys which infest the hillside, eagerly devouring any food offered or dropped by tourists. While Swayambhunath is the oldest and perhaps the most important site of Buddhist worship in Kathmandu, it's also revered by the Hindus, which explains the presence of several Hindu shrines scattered around the circumference of the main stupa. This joint veneration is characteristic of Nepal, which over the ages was colonized chiefly by Hindus from India and Buddhists from Tibet. As a result, the legends and practices of the 2 religions have been mutually influential, with Buddhists and Hindus worshiping and respecting each other's shrines and festivals. The spectacular Bodhnath Stupa, located 4 miles east of downtown Kathmandu, is the largest of its kind in Nepal, its spire rising 125 feet above the plaza on a hemispherical dome 100 feet in diameter. Tibetan Buddhists, whose numbers were bolstered by refugees fleeing south following the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1959, consider this their spiritual home away from home. Like many of the larger stupas in Nepal and Tibet, Bodhnath sits on a 4-tiered rectangular base signifying earth, surmounted by a hemispherical dome representing water, and topped by a spire on whose 4-sided base the watchful eyes of Buddha survey the world. What appears to be a nose is actually the number 1 in Nepali script, signifying the unity of all life. The rest of the spire comprises a 13-step pyramid signifying the 13 stages on the journey to nirvana, truncated by an umbrella representing air and the pinnacle, ether. The brick wall surrounding the stupa contains hundreds of prayer wheels, each bearing the sacred Buddhist mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, which translates, "Hail to the jewel in the lotus." On the western bank of the sacred Bagmati River, less than 2 miles southeast of Bodhnath, lies the Shiva Temple of Pashupatinath, the most important site of Hindu worship in Nepal. Shiva is jointly the creator and destroyer of the Hindu pantheon, appearing in both virtuous and evil forms. Pashupati, a benevolent incarnation of Shiva, is known as Lord of the Beasts and protector of all animals, including humans. The temple may only be entered by Hindus and is best observed from across the river, a vantage point which also allows unobstructed views of the rectangular cremation ghats which hug the eastern riverbank. 1 or more cremations are usually underway here, creating an unremarkable spectacle which nonetheless draws hordes of camera-wielding tourists whose actions are hardly reverential. The areas surrounding Pashupatinath contain many other temples and sculptures and are infested by bizarre individuals such as this one who, according to our guide, is not the Hindu ascetic he would have you believe, but rather a derelict in costume, begging for handouts from gullible tourists. While Kathmandu's rich architectural heritage illuminates its colorful history, it does little to characterize its people, most of whom reside in the country where they conduct a simple agrarian lifestyle vastly different from that pursued by the urban hordes trapped in the squalor and congestion of the city. Mountaineering of necessity involves treks into remote areas not seen by the average traveler, and provides ideal opportunities to observe at first hand how these people live, work, and worship. Several years ago, I joined an expedition to Mount Everest organized and led by my friend Rick Wilcox, an experienced Himalayan mountaineer who succeeded in reaching the summit of the world's highest peak on this his first attempt. My position was that of a support climber, and as such, my permit restricted me from venturing above Everest Base Camp, but allowed me to accompany the summit climbers on ascents of two 20,000-foot peaks nearby for practice and acclimatization. Climbing Everest is a 3-month affair, shortened somewhat by the availability of a tiny airstrip at Lukla, a major town on the way to base camp, about a week by foot from the nearest road, but less than 40 minutes by plane from Kathmandu. Lukla is serviced exclusively by helicopters and small propeller aircraft capable of managing the narrow dirt airstrip, which is barely 1,200 feet long and slopes upward at a serious angle. This incline assists landing planes in braking to a stop without crashing into the cliff at the far end of the field, an exercise likened to parking your car in the garage at 80 miles an hour. Wrecked aircraft alongside the field bear witness to unfortunate pilots who failed to make it, although I noticed on my most recent trip here that the wreckage has been cleared and the runway is soon to be paved. Like most towns on popular trekking routes, Lukla is growing explosively, a situation which can only accelerate here following improvements to the landing facilities at the airport. The town is populated principally by Buddhist Nepali of Tibetan stock, including Sherpas, the famous inhabitants of mountainous regions whose climbing prowess and endurance makes them indispensable on expeditions such as ours. Ergen Sherpa, our Sirdar or local leader on this trip, will hire many other Sherpas to assist him, as well as people of lower castes such as porters and yak drivers, to help with transporting the tons of food, fuel, and equipment we will need for the duration of the expedition. We erect tents for our one-night stay here in the backyard of one of the local inns, or tea houses as they are called, which pervade the more popular trekking routes throughout Nepal. In fact, on the trail to Everest, one can scarcely hike half a mile without finding at least one. Climbers, however, generally prefer tents in view of their privacy, cleanliness, and freedom from the acrid smoke emanating from the yak dung fires used by innkeepers in their kitchens, which lack chimneys for ventilation. In the morning, we break camp and shoulder our backpacks, delighted finally to be under our own power. For the next 2 days, the trail parallels the Dudh Kosi River, crossing it frequently as the terrain dictates. Most bridges spanning rivers in Nepal are festooned with prayer flags, suggesting that almighty protection is needed for those with the temerity to venture upon them. Indeed, they tend to shake and sway disconcertingly with traffic, and some have gaps in the footbed large enough to swallow an inattentive hiker. We are constantly reminded of the abiding spirituality of the Nepalese by countless mani walls and stupas encountered along the trail, and we pass them out of respect in a clockwise direction, keeping them always to the right of us as prescribed by Buddhist religion. Walls and stupas are solid structures lined with mani stones, so named because they are inscribed with the Buddhist mantra Am Mani Padme Hum. Eventually, we begin the steep climb out of the Dudh Kosi Gorge, ascending through forests of blue pine and rhododendron, with breathtaking outlooks to the valley far below, where the river has now shrunk to a silver thread, tracing its sinuous course downward. After several hours of steady climbing, the forest dissolves to reveal a spectacular amphitheater enclosing more than 100 stone dwellings arranged in concentric arcs carved out of the steep hillside. This is the town of Namche Bazaar, headquarters of the Sherpa people and administrative center for the Sagarmatha National Park, which contains Mount Everest and its environs, also known as the Solu Khumbu. We will spend several days here at 11,500 feet acclimatizing while our Sirdar, Ergun Sherpa, organizes many tons of food, camping equipment, and climbing gear, and hires porters and yak drivers to carry it upwards to base camp. During the main climbing seasons in the spring and fall, Namche swarms with trekkers and climbers who outnumber its native population, providing valuable income for the Khumbu region. Shops here are burgeoning with vast assortments of Nepali trinkets, both authentic and counterfeit, as well as new and recycled mountaineering equipment for purchase or rental. Namche's strategic location in the Khumbu has encouraged rapid growth, with new construction evident everywhere. The abundance of solid rock makes it the preferred building material, but wood, still indispensable for flooring and framing, is scarce and expensive, reflecting widespread deforestation for fuel. In constructing a typical dwelling, workers begin by mining the hillsides for boulders, breaking them with heavy sledgehammers into pieces suitable for hand carry to the building site, where stonemasons hew them into rectangular blocks. A shallow trench is dug to receive the foundation, upon which the walls rise layer by layer, carefully plumbed and leveled. Roofs, floors, and frames for doors and windows are crafted from thick planks, pit-sawed from large timbers by a pair of sawyers who work in tandem above and below an elevated sawhorse. These craftsmen are extremely efficient, completing a typical dwelling in a few months, a feat all the more remarkable since work is performed manually without benefit of power equipment. After 3 days here, we leave Namche, detouring first through Kunde with its hospital built with funds raised by Sir Edmund Hillary, Everest's first conqueror, and Kumjung, a charming Sherpa village notable for its high school, attended by most of the children in the area. A steep descent to the Dudkosi River precedes an even steeper climb to Tengbo She, picturesquely perched on a ridge crest, offering an unparalleled panorama of Himalayan giants, including Everest, whose summit peers over a vast mountain wall dominated by Lhotse, the world's fourth highest peak. In spite of the view, Tengbo She's fame stems from its monastery, which over the past century has suffered onslaughts from earthquakes and fires, the most recent occurring in 1989 when an overturned heater burned it to the ground. Its current reincarnation is home to nearly 100 Buddhist monks who, upon our arrival, appear to be in a state of extreme excitement. The reason for this is soon evident with the approach of a helicopter bearing none other than Hillary himself, whom the Nepalese revere virtually as a saint. This reflects not only his mountaineering fame and love of Nepal, but also his fundraising efforts on its behalf, which have attracted vast contributions to construction projects throughout the country. Once an annual visitor to the monastery, Hillary is reputedly in poor health, having also developed, ironically, an intolerance to high altitude. Consequently, this may be his last trip to the Himalaya. Over the next 9 days, our trek to Everest Base Camp takes us across terrain increasingly spectacular. We pass Ama Dablam, surely among the most beautiful of mountains, and, gaining altitude steadily, mount a hillside paralleling the Dudkosi River with incredible outlooks into a broad valley lined by granite giants plastered with snow and ice. Breaking through 16,000 feet, we're now entering an alpine environment ruled by withering wind and bitter cold, where little if anything can survive except lichen and occasional patches of grass, which flourish briefly during the summer monsoon. Eventually, we approach Gorak Shep with its tiny stone huts which have risen in response to traffic bound for Everest Base Camp, now only a few hours away. This minuscule enclave is perched on a terminal moraine of the Khumbu Glacier, in a wide valley beside a frozen lake above which a hill of dark boulders called Kalapatar rises to an altitude of 18,500 feet, providing a breathtaking view of Everest and its neighbor Lhotse. On the saddle between these two giants is the famous South Col, where climbers pitch their final camp at 26,000 feet on the way to the summit of Mount Everest. To the right of Lhotse is the sharp spire of Nuptse, which, being much closer to us, appears to dominate its higher neighbors, although it's actually several thousand feet lower. We spend 2 nights at Gorakshep to acclimatize, and I make several trips up Kalapatar for magnificent views of this hostile landscape. The final trek to base camp mounts the rock-strewn Khumbu Glacier, skirting yawning crevasses and giant stalagmites of ice in a tortuous path through a monochrome world of utter desolation. We pass a train of yaks bearing heavy loads of food and equipment bound for our camp, and traverse ponds thinly covered with ice, which occasionally cracks underfoot, threatening to drop us into water of unknown depth. Rounding a cluster of boulders, we suddenly enter a vast glacial basin over a square mile in area, surrounded on 3 sides by vertical cliffs of rock and ice. We have finally reached base camp at 17,500 feet, and although there are perhaps 1,200 climbers encamped here, comprising several expeditions, the scale of this place is such that it appears virtually deserted. As our camp begins to take shape, Ergen Sherpa directs construction of an enclosure for our kitchen out of rocks gathered nearby. This is one of several stone huts that will be built to house our valuable supplies. It's interesting to note here that since we're camped upon a glacier that flows downward at a speed of a foot or so per day, none of these rock structures will survive intact for long, collapsing into piles of rubble within a year. We busy ourselves pitching tents on rocks rearranged to make platforms as smooth and level as possible. The view from base camp is dominated by the intimidating Khumbu Icefall, a massive jumble of building-sized blocks of ice towering more than 3,000 feet high, which constitute perhaps the most dangerous obstacle in the ascent of Everest. Expeditions will spend at least a month here preparing a route through the icefall, anchoring fixed lines to the giant blocks which, however, topple unpredictably from time to time, dispatching anyone nearby to a glacial tomb. Climbers will traverse this icefall many times as they carry supplies to higher camps on the mountain, and the added security of fixed lines makes these dangerous trips less hazardous. Base camp is a most inhospitable place. High mountains attract bad weather, and our location here in the midst of them subjects us to daily afternoon storms with up to 2 feet of snow, which we must shovel from our tents lest they collapse under its weight. It's also a place full of unusual, if not disquieting, sounds. Warmly ensconced in my sleeping bag at night, I'm frequently awakened by the shattering rumble of avalanches plunging off surrounding cliffs, and by thunderous cracks and groans as the glacier beneath us ruptures to accommodate its downward motion. But most awesome of all, perhaps, is the distant roar of the jet stream, blasting the summit of Everest with winds of more than 150 miles per hour. After a week at base camp, restlessness and the urge for adventure prompts me to join several expedition climbers on a warm-up climb of Imja, a 20,300-foot ice peak several days' hike south of Everest. Anywhere else in the world, this mountain would be a formidable giant, but here it's merely a minor satellite of nearby behemoths such as Lhotse, whose 12,000-foot south face, seen here, has never been climbed. The trail to Gyantse follows the picturesque valley of the Imja River, with its sprinkling of tiny towns beginning to awake from the long winter. Each afternoon on our 3-day approach, we camp near the river, but always, it seems, in the shadow of Ama Dablam, whose myriad pinnacles, cliffs, and hanging glaciers become increasingly awesome as our changing viewpoints from front to side profile their dramatic verticality. Our final camp is placed on a glacial moraine in a narrow valley near the base of Gyantse, at an elevation of about 16,700 feet. This site is utterly bleak, with no view except for the featureless lower flank of the mountain, and it is known to be vulnerable to avalanches after heavy snowfall. Fortunately, the slope is bare, and after pitching our tents and consuming a meager supper, we retire early, for tomorrow will be a long day. Rising at 2 a.m., I struggle with my clothing in the narrow confines of the tent, since it's far too cold to dress outside. Emerging from our tents into an overcast night, we don headlamps and ascend steep, grassy slopes littered with boulders. After several hours, we reach the snow line, whose surface in places has hardened into solid ice, and we pause to attach crampons and seat harnesses, as this is the rope-up point. Dawn finds us near the base of the glacier, and mounting it, we confront an unexpected maze of crevasses invisible to us from below. Nevertheless, we overcome them, occasionally traversing narrow ice bridges of marginal integrity, an activity discouraging photography. Eventually, we approach a steep gully interrupted by sections of nearly vertical ice, which we ascend on the front points of our crampons, and topping out, avoid another crevasse field while passing beneath seracs delicately poised above us. Another steep gully choked with boulders finally leads to the summit ridge, an airy knife edge undulating upward for half a mile or so, with snow-covered ice plunging steeply away on both sides to the glaciers far below. Most guided expeditions, which spend 2 days climbing Gyantse, protect this ridge with fixed ropes in view of the exposure, but we've opted to forsake them since ours is a one-day ascent. The final peak is steep and icy, but fortunately rises less than 100 yards above the ridge, and we finally reach the 20,300-foot summit at noon. The second rope team is well behind us, but we finally glimpse them and follow their progress as they negotiate the last section of the ridge, joining us on the summit at 2:30 p.m. Most normal people are at a loss to understand why mountaineers do these things. In search of better understanding, journalists often approach the subject from a different angle, asking the climber to describe his thoughts and feelings upon reaching the summit. Responses to this are usually unsatisfactory, for in truth, the climber's initial reaction to summiting is generally relief, followed by an overpowering urge to descend. In reality, summit impressions are usually developed retrospectively. This is because a mountaineer's high frequently succeeds his moment of triumph by weeks or months. His body so numbed by fatigue and oxygen deprivation at the time that his brain can grasp only subliminally the scope and beauty of an achievement which upon later reflection will emerge with glorious clarity, purged of painful memories by the mind's remarkable filter of selective recollection. Thus, in recalling my summit experiences, the feelings of exhaustion, of cold, of gasping for breath amidst paroxysms of coughing, pale beside the glow of an achievement which for me is sublime. Practically speaking, mountaineering is devoid of reason or purpose, yet in a very real sense it exemplifies man's innate curiosity, his unquenchable thirst for adventure and exploration, and his need to experience the unknown, discovering along the way the elegance and harmony of the natural world, and his ability to function within it. He climbs not for power, fame, or money, but for what it does to his psyche, and he emerges from the experience revitalized and with a new sense of self-confidence born of achievement in the face of adversity. After mountaineering expeditions, climbers often opt for the warmth and tranquility of a tropical beach. In our case, we have something else in mind. Not all of Nepal is mountainous, as we know its southern regions, known as the Terai, abut the Gangetic Plain of India, which, barely above sea level, is covered by dense jungles interlaced by crocodile-infested rivers. The Royal Chitwan National Park, home of the awesome Bengal tiger, is located in the heart of this country, which is the site of our next adventure. Early one May morning in Kathmandu, we catch a small plane bound for Bharatpur, one of the few towns with an airstrip near the Royal Chitwan Park. After a 50-minute flight, we touch down on a grassy runway and are met by a minivan which whisks us 15 miles south to the park's gateway on the banks of the Narayani River. Here we climb aboard elephants for the 2-hour slog across shallow waters and through dense jungles to Island Jungle Resort, a collection of tiny thatched huts clustered along the shore of a narrow island in the middle of the river. Riding an elephant is at best uncomfortable, particularly here in the jungle where from April to October daytime temperatures often exceed 100 degrees with high humidity and rarely fall below 80 at night. Our elephant saddles, or howdahs as they are called, consist of square cushioned platforms enclosed by wooden railings for support. They accommodate up to 4 people who sit at the corners, dangling their legs over the side. An elephant driver, or mahout, straddles the animal's neck, where commands are administered both verbally and by appropriate kicks to its ears or taps on its head or neck, with a short stick. Mahouts are dedicated to a single elephant, conducting a 2-year training program when the animal reaches its 15th year. Arriving at the resort, we're given a brief lunch, followed by another 2-hour elephant ride, this time into the center of the island on a wildlife quest. The most prolific big animal in the park is the one-horned Indian rhinoceros, reputedly the world's third largest land mammal, reaching a shoulder height of 6 feet at maturity and a weight exceeding 2 tons. Its diet is principally grass, and while its senses of smell and hearing are acute, its poor eyesight and irascibility provoke it to charge any suspicious moving object at speeds up to 25 miles per hour, seemingly remarkable for an animal of its size and bulk. The many grazing rhinos we encounter during our mini safari provoke low grumbles from the elephants, who seem wary of them despite the rhino's inferior size. All of us are on the alert for the elusive Bengal tiger, reputedly the world's largest cat, but our guide indicates that these nocturnal animals are rarely seen in daytime. Returning from our ride in the mid-afternoon, we're invited to join the mahouts in an elephant river bath, a treat these animals relish. Only a few of us accept the invitation, since the prospect of sharing the muddy river with Indian crocodiles, which lurk prominently on the shore, is too much for most. While entering the cool water on the bare backs of the elephants provides wonderful relief from the tropical heat, thoughts of the crocodiles are not far from my mind, despite assurances from our mahouts that we're safe near the elephants. The following afternoon, when the group is summoned for yet another elephant ride into the jungle, I ask whether I might travel by foot instead. Our head guide, clearly delighted with the prospect, volunteers to accompany me, and to my amusement arms me with a staff barely more substantial than a broomstick. Heading off in a different direction from the others, we soon leave the main trail and encounter jungle dense enough to require a machete, a tool my guide has forgotten. Struggling through this for a while, we eventually emerge into a clearing and confront a mature rhino grazing less than 10 yards away. Unamused by our presence, he lowers his head and charges, accelerating to full speed in an instant. Fortunately, the shelter of a nearby tree allows a narrow escape as the rhino thunders by. This being sufficient excitement for an afternoon, we trace a path back to the others and follow closely behind them for protection as they return to the resort. The following morning, we mount elephants for the 2-hour trek back to the road, where our minivan and driver are waiting to transport us to the airstrip and our return to Kathmandu. Most treks in Nepal explore the southern slopes of the Himalaya, which are luxuriant primarily because downpours from the summer monsoon originating in the Bay of Bengal off the east coast of India provide abundant precipitation. The vast barrier wall of the Himalaya keeps this moisture from traveling north into Tibet, which consequently has an arid climate diametrically opposite from that of Nepal. The sole exception to this is a small section of Nepal north of Annapurna and 120 miles west of Kathmandu, where the border wanders into territory shielded by the Himalaya with a climate resembling that of Tibet. Having never ventured there myself, I arranged an expedition in the fall of 2001 with my friend Rick Wilcox to circumambulate Annapurna, which would take us from the lush forests of the south to the arid valleys of the north, amidst a panoply of contrasting scenery. Let's now fast forward to this adventure, which begins with a bumpy 8-hour drive west from Kathmandu to a trailhead in the little town of Beni. Over the next week, our route climbs through dense forests to ridgetops, then descends to raging rivers, each successive crest higher than the last. One ridgetop, known as Poon Hill, provides a breathtaking view of Dhaulagiri, the world's 7th highest mountain. Other sections of the trail reveal such giants as Annapurna South, Nilgiri, and Machu Picchu, the famous holy peak off-limits to climbers whose summit resembles a fishtail. Eventually, we reach our intermediate goal, the Annapurna Sanctuary, a desolate valley of glacial debris surrounded by an arc of razor-edged peaks, with Annapurna, number 10 in the world, capping a vast mountain wall enclosing the northern boundary of the sanctuary. Annapurna's 12,000-foot south face Prominent in this photograph is a difficult and nearly vertical series of rock and ice precipices, which has had only one successful ascent. After a morning of photography, clouds close in, and we begin our 3-day descent, diverging to a different trail which follows a lovely valley with magnificent views of the Annapurnas receding into the distance. The fall harvest has just concluded, and we pass families compacting their hay for storage. Eventually, we reach the road where a van awaits to transport us to Pokhara, Nepal's second largest city. Boarding a small plane at the airport, we fly north over the Annapurna Range to Hongdae, a tiny village in the arid rain shadow of the Himalayas. Here we commence our week-long trek up the desolate valley of the Marsiangdi River, bordered on both sides by high peaks, including Annapurnas 2 and 4, now to our south. Since Wilcox has invited me to join an expedition to climb one or both of these mountains in 2003, our photos of them will help in planning the best route. As we parallel the river on our upward course, the land becomes increasingly arid, and we attach masks to protect us from the constant wind which strafes us with blinding clouds of dust. The natives here are primarily traders, augmenting their earnings by herding yaks and cultivating what meager crops will grow in this area of limited rainfall. Our trek coincides with an annual festival featuring animal sacrifice, and we pass a field with families slaughtering and butchering their yaks. Camping near remote villages such as the famous Menang, by whose name the people in this area are known, our trail undulates upward for 15 miles to a promontory overlooking the river, across from which an enormous moraine of glacial debris plunges downward from the 18,000-foot Thorong La Pass, out of sight far above us. Descending to the river, we begin our climb to the Thorong La, camping near a trekker's lodge partway up the trail, from which a bluff behind the camp provides an incredible view of the valley now far below us. Rising early the next morning, we continue our steep ascent to the pass, where a giant cairn supports a web of prayer flags flapping frantically in the wind. To our west, the trail plunges even more steeply toward the valley of the Kaligandaki River, nearly 10,000 feet below the pass. Early in the afternoon, we reach the holy town of Muktanath, a pilgrimage destination for Buddhists and Hindus, and camp in a nearby village which hosts a charming little monastery whose roof provides a sweeping view of the surrounding countryside and the route of our descent. In the morning, we hike down to the riverbed of the Kaligandaki and follow it for several miles to the town of Jamasam, where we catch a plane to Kathmandu the next morning. Our journey to the remote valley of the Marsiangdi has provided a taste of the Tibetan landscape, but no hint of a country which has suffered so many vicissitudes of fortune throughout its history. During the year 2000, I made 2 trips to Tibet, first as a mountaineer with a climbing group, and later as a solitary photojournalist. We'll combine these 2 trips into one, commencing first with some history for a better understanding of this amazing yet troubled country. While mythology clouds much of Tibet's past, credible history begins in the 7th century AD, when Songtsen Gampo, a powerful king, established a dynasty which expanded the country's borders to encompass an area the size of Western Europe, engulfing, in the process, territories previously controlled by China, Nepal, and India. This dynasty was China's military equal and persisted for 2 centuries, during which time Buddhism entered the country from India, and a written language patterned after Indian script was developed. Eventually, adherents of the traditional Bon religion clashed with the Buddhists, and the empire collapsed into a disunified group of autonomous principalities. In the 13th century, Mongolian armies led by Genghis Khan and later by Kublai Khan conquered vast areas of Central Asia, including Tibet, which, however, was able to develop a unique relationship with its conqueror, based on the Mongols' profound respect for the religious teachings of Buddhist lamas. Consequently, even though Tibet was technically a vassal state, it enjoyed virtual autonomy under the spiritual leadership of its chief lamas, who were successively appointed regents by the Mongols. This suzerainty endured for several centuries and saw the rise of the Gelugpa, or Yellow Hat sect of Buddhists, founded by the great teacher and scholar Tsongkhapa. The third Gelugpa Lama was so revered by the Mongols that he was awarded the title of Dalai Lama, the term Dalai meaning ocean in their language, implying that his knowledge was as vast as the ocean. Succeeding Dalai Lamas continued to command the Mongols' respect until the death of the most powerful fifth Dalai Lama in 1682, following which Mongolian influence in Asia began to wane. In 1720, a new Asian group, the Manchu, conquered China and established the Qing dynasty, which ruled until 1911, succumbing in turn to a republican revolution led by Sun Yat-sen. Concurrently, Tibet escaped from China's grip and declared its independence with the help of Nepal and the British, who were then in control of the Indian subcontinent. But Tibet's de facto independence survived less than 50 years. Political instability in China fomented a civil war in which Mao Zedong's communists defeated the government of Chiang Kai-shek, forming the People's Republic of China in 1949. Mao quickly moved to reabsorb Tibet, and in 1950 troops were dispatched to the border, where an inept Tibetan force guarding it was easily defeated. Appeals for help from the United Nations, India, the US, and Britain were unproductive, and Tibet was ultimately forced to sign a humiliating agreement acknowledging its status as an integral part of China. Deteriorating conditions during the ensuing years culminated in a massive uprising in Lhasa in 1959 by Tibetans fearing that the Chinese were about to kidnap the 14th Dalai Lama. Their concerns were well-founded, and he barely escaped before his residence was overrun by the Chinese, leaving them with a hollow victory. His flight ended in Dharamsala, an abandoned British hill station in northwestern India, where Prime Minister Nehru granted him asylum. There he lives to this day, promoting Tibet's cause to a preoccupied world as yet unprepared to do anything about it. The atrocities inflicted upon Tibet by the Chinese in the decade following the Dalai Lama's escape rank among the most appalling in the annals of history. Having crushed the revolt in Lhasa, Mao Zedong imposed martial law and launched a brutal campaign to convert the entire population of China and Tibet to the communist cause. Growing impatient with its progress and fearing that Chinese communism would degenerate into the impure Russian paradigm, Mao initiated his Cultural Revolution in 1966 and mobilized the infamous Red Guards to purge the country of bourgeois contamination. In an orgy of organized mob violence, the revolution spilled over into Tibet, where more than 6,000 monasteries were looted, desecrated, and virtually destroyed. Countless manuscripts converted to toilet paper, priceless paintings defaced, and sculptures hammered into dust. This, together with pandemic torture, rape, and mutilation, constituted a comprehensive effort to eradicate the totality of Tibetan culture, religion, and thought. In addition, the country was devastated environmentally by the wholesale clear-cutting of forests, the mindless slaughter of wildlife, and the forced planting of inappropriate crops, causing widespread famine. Although we may never know the exact cost of the Cultural Revolution in human terms, a report issued by the United States Warren Committee estimated the death toll at somewhere between 30 and 60 million individuals, including 1/5 of the entire Tibetan population. After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China under Deng Xiaoping realized the failure of the Cultural Revolution and adopted a more pragmatic approach by restoring a modicum of religious freedom while making unsuccessful overtures to the Dalai Lama in exile to resolve differences between the two countries. A widespread campaign was undertaken to repair damaged monasteries and return what looted art and manuscripts remained. The country was open to tourism for the first time, albeit under tight control, and China accelerated its program of economic development, constructing power plants, highways, and communication and water treatment facilities throughout the land. These efforts were hardly philanthropic, however, since the primary reason for reacquiring Tibet was to protect Chinese borders from potential incursions by India and Russia. All of this required managerial talent, which China would only entrust to its own, and the ensuing and continuing influx of Chinese to fill necessary jobs has threatened to make Tibetans a minority in their own country. In recent decades, Tibetan life has improved modestly, although continued dissatisfaction with Chinese oppression has fostered demonstrations which, predictably, have been brutally suppressed. In the fall of 2000, I revisited Tibet as a solitary photojournalist, hoping to examine this unique country more closely than was possible during my first trip the previous spring, when as a member of a mountaineering expedition I was preoccupied with preparations for a major climb. Communist dictatorships are inherently paranoid, and China is no exception. Accordingly, while climbing and trekking groups are encouraged to visit Tibet, their fixed itineraries and leadership control affording easier surveillance, the Chinese rarely grant Tibetan visas to lone individuals who they assume are spies or, more likely, journalists bent on exposing conditions inimical to China's image. In the interest of protecting those who facilitated my entry into Tibet, I will avoid details except to say that my flight to Lhasa involved overnights in Hong Kong and Chengdu. Hong Kong is familiar to many of us, but Chengdu, I suspect, is not. It was for me a revelation. This city of 7 million is situated on the fertile lowland plains of central China, beneath the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, 800 miles northwest of Hong Kong and a like distance east of Lhasa. Contrary to my expectations of an impoverished urban sprawl, Chengdu resembles an affluent American metropolis, replete with impressive skyscrapers, broad avenues crowded with traffic, and spacious parks with manicured lawns interspersed with rows of brilliant flowers. Modern department stores teem with seemingly prosperous Chinese, shopping for TVs, housewares, and Western-style clothing. My accommodations in the high-rise Holiday Inn rival those in a major U.S. city, and excellent food is available in a variety of good restaurants. Superficially, at least, there's little to indicate that I'm not in a free country, yet the intimidating statue of Mao Zedong presiding over the central square invokes the Orwellian specter of Big Brother and suggests that all may not be as it appears. In the early morning, I board a jet for the 2-hour flight to Lhasa, leaving the verdant plains of central China behind as we approach the outlying slopes of the Tibetan Plateau. The land soon loses its veneer of green as we enter the rain shadow of the Himalayas, whose vast barrier wall to the south impedes precipitation from heading north into Tibet. We touch down at Lhasa's Gangkar Airport and disembark, armed soldiers with submachine guns monitoring our entry into the terminal. Once inside, I'm greeted by my Tibetan guide Tenzin, who is fluent in English, Tibetan, and Chinese, and by our Chinese driver Zhang, who Tenzin claims neither speaks nor understands our language. Escorting me outside, they help load my baggage into a waiting SUV, and we're soon on our way, speeding along a narrow paved road against a background of stark desolation. Unlike Napal, where every inch of soil is cultivated and an abundance of stone houses dot the verdant landscape, the parched earth here supports little growth, and there's scant evidence of humanity except for rare glimpses of distant dwellings, or this Buddhist artifact chiseled into a nearby cliff. Eventually, however, signs of habitation appear on the horizon, signaling our approach to Lhasa, and before long we enter the city, proceeding down a broad avenue lined with drab, low buildings decidedly un-Tibetan. In fact, nowhere in this country are the results of China's modernizing efforts more dismally apparent than here in Lhasa, where most of the city's original rustic dwellings have been bulldozed and replaced by utilitarian structures of the most dreadful architectural banality. A view of Lhasa from a prominent hill reveals the extent of this blight, and it's likely that the accompanying influx of Chinese over the past several decades has made Tibetans a minority in their own capital, which was, and probably still is, the heart and soul of Tibet. This is because important vestiges of the old Lhasa escaped demolition, including most notably the sacred Jokhang Temple, the magnificent Potala Palace, and the Norbulingka. Let's now visit them. The Jokhang is the holiest, most revered religious structure in Tibet, commanding the center of a labyrinth of streets which constitute what now must ironically be called the Tibetan quarter of Lhasa. It's the spiritual heart of the city. Construction of the temple was begun by King Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century AD, and it's probably Tibet's oldest religious institution. The temple is fronted by Barkor Square, a broad plaza lined with tables and stalls brimming with merchandise, and swarming with activity as shoppers and tourists mix incongruously with worshippers, all of whom seek entrance to the Jokhang or to the corridor of narrow streets surrounding it, which constitute one of the most important koras or pilgrimage circuits in Tibet. Visitors to the Jokhang usually do the kora first, merging with a river of humanity circumambulating the temple in a clockwise direction as prescribed by Buddhist tradition. This circuit, which is even more crowded with stalls than the square, is the place Tibetans go to shop. The entrance to the Jokhang faces a small forecourt, paved with stones polished smooth by hordes of prostrating worshippers over many centuries of devotion. One enters the temple up several stone steps, which lead to the roofless main assembly hall, flanked on one side by a portico whose walls are lined with tiers of flickering butter lamps. A long corridor, open to the sky, surrounds the inner Jokhang and contains hundreds of brass prayer wheels, which throngs of devout pilgrims keep spinning as they pass by, silently mouthing their mantras. Once inside, the senses are saturated by odors of incense and burning oil, by sounds of shuffling feet and quiet prayer, and by the sight of flickering butter lamps which illuminate hundreds of sacred icons and statues, all of which combine to create an atmosphere of profound spirituality. Countless chapels commemorate the many deities of the Buddhist pantheon, including Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, of whom the Dalai Lama is the living embodiment, and Sakyamuni, the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, whose shrine is the most important in all of Tibet and perhaps the principal attraction of the Jokhang. Ascending to the top floor, one gains a better perspective of the Jokhang's layout and its stunning crest of gilded roofs. The perimeter of the temple is adorned by impressive golden statuary, including 2 deer facing the wheel of Dharma, which signifies an important sermon by Sakyamuni in a deer park. This symbol can be found on the rooftops of many Tibetan monasteries throughout the country. Last but not least are the many expansive views of Lhasa, including that of the distant Potala Palace, which we'll visit next. The Potala, Lhasa's cardinal landmark, is the largest and most awesome structure in Tibet, virtually engulfing a 400-foot hill in the center of town. It's prominently visible from the surrounding countryside and presents a mind-boggling spectacle of multifaceted medieval architecture. Containing more than 1,000 rooms within 1.4 million square feet of enclosed space, the Potala's complex assemblage of attached buildings consists of the White Palace, completed by the 5th Dalai Lama in 1649, and the Red Palace, conceived by him but completed after his death in 1682 by Sangye Gyatso, who subsequently became regent of Tibet. The White Palace served as the seat of Tibetan government and contains reception halls, administrative offices, and private quarters for the Dalai Lamas on the top floor. The Red Palace was conceived as a religious temple and contains countless chapels and shrines, as well as the remains of all Dalai Lamas from the 5th on. With the current 14th Dalai Lama living in exile in Dharamsala, the Potala is unoccupied and functions solely as a museum. The primary entrances to the Potala are broad switchback staircases on the south side and a steep road on the north, which terminates near the roof of the palace. From here, innumerable open-aired courtyards and walkways provide expansive views of the myriad golden roofs and gilded spires of the palace, as well as a 360-degree panorama of the surrounding city and countryside. Visitors to the Potala usually enter by way of the North Side Road and descend through the many halls and chapels of the palace to the southern staircase, which ends at ground level across from the vast Tiananmen-style plaza, constructed by the Chinese over the bulldozed remains of the Tibetan village which used to occupy that spot. Except for its view of the Potala, the plaza's only interesting feature is a tall flagpole supporting a Chinese flag around which armed soldiers stand guard 24 hours a day to prevent the repetition of a recent incident in which some overzealous Tibetans replaced the Chinese flag with a Tibetan one in the dark of night. About 1.5 miles southwest of the Potala lies the Norbulingka, or Jewel Park, construction of which was begun by the 7th Dalai Lama in 1755 and augmented by others in later years. Surrounded by a high masonry wall, this 89-acre complex of minor palaces and residences contains a picturesque lake which used to be crowded with fish. The Norbulingka was favored by the Dalai Lamas as a summer residence, and it was here that the current 14th Dalai Lama took refuge during the height of the Cultural Revolution, narrowly escaping at night disguised as a Chinese soldier. Considering Lhasa's position during the past 6 centuries as Tibet's largest city and spiritual center, it's not surprising that its environs host some of Tibet's most important monasteries. Chief among these is the Drepung, located in the foothills 5 miles northwest of the city. It dates to 1416 and entombs the remains of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Dalai Lamas. Prior to the Cultural Revolution, this Gelugpa, or Yellow Hat Monastery, was the largest monastic institution in the world, housing more than 10,000 monks who were specially selected from many applicants to live and study here. It was a major center of Buddhist learning. Most of the monks fled during the Revolution or perished at the hands of the Red Guard, but some have returned and the resident population is currently around 600. Visitors proceed through the Drepung complex in a clockwise direction, following a kora or pilgrimage circuit around the monastery which connects its major buildings. One of these, the Ganden Palace, was the residence of the Dalai Lamas until completion of the Potala in 1649. It's accessed by a short staircase at the rear of a small courtyard containing a tree supposedly as old as the Drepung itself. This staircase gains entrance to the principal courtyard, which is bounded on 3 sides by 2-story residential quarters, and by the main palace on the 4th. Inside are offices, statues, and the ornate throne of the 5th Dalai Lama. Perhaps the most impressive structure in the Drepung complex is the Chamshan, or main assembly hall, which is fronted by an enormous terrace where resident monks regularly meet to engage in spirited debates. Inside the building is a large meeting hall nearly 20,000 square feet in area, containing 181 pillars festooned with banners and fabric-backed religious paintings, or tankas, some of which also hang from the ceiling. The columns of pillars are paralleled by rows of benches covered by the saffron robes of the monks, who gather there several times a day to meditate and pray. At the rear of the hall and in connected rooms are chapels containing statues of Buddhas and other religious figures, around which worshippers pass, quietly mouthing their prayers. Other significant buildings within the Drepung complex are the Tratsangs, or colleges, each devoted to the study of a particular aspect of Buddhist religion, including Tantrism, logic, and Tibetan medicine. Many provide broad views of the complex, including this curious flat-sided structure 60 feet tall, whose sole purpose is the hanging of an enormous tanka during the Drepung festival once a year. A similar but even larger tanka wall celebrates an annual religious festival at the Tashalunpo Monastery in Shigatse, which we shall visit shortly. Having toured several of Lhasa's most important sites, let's now begin our 600-mile journey westward across the plains of Tibet, on the country's principal artery, the Friendship Highway, which extends to the border with Nepal. Except for short stretches near major towns, this incredible road is narrow, unpaved, and in many places virtually impassable by all but the most rugged vehicles. It crosses 6 high passes, some exceeding 17,000 feet, and provides sweeping vistas of vast ochre plains, shimmering turquoise lakes, and snow-capped peaks which form a continuum of stark beauty unsurpassed elsewhere in the world. 160 miles and 6 hours of hard driving southwest of Lhasa lies the medieval town of Gyantse, one of the few that has not surrendered its Tibetan character to the ravages of the Cultural Revolution. Gyantse's principal attraction is a walled complex containing the Kumbum Chorten, one of the most magnificent examples of Buddhist architecture in Tibet. This 8-storied chorten, or religious monument, was constructed in 1440 and contains more than 70 chapels which display literally thousands of paintings and images depicting the gamut of Buddhist deities. Many of these are of high quality and are considered important forerunners of Tibetan art prevalent in later centuries. The upper floors of the Kumbum provide sweeping views of the town, as well as that of an imposing fort crowning a nearby hill. This is the Gyantse Dzong, a complex of castles and other buildings which have decayed to the point where there is little to see of interest except for loftier outlooks over the town and surrounding countryside. A 60-mile journey further west along the Friendship Highway brings us to Tibet's second largest town, Shigatse, site of the famous Tashalunpo Monastery. Unlike Gyantse, Shigatse clearly reflects China's modernizing efforts in a garish archway spanning the city's principal thoroughfare, along which rows of utilitarian buildings of the most artistically bankrupt style display glass facades of electric blue and enormous Chinese characters literally screaming for attention. Perhaps the only truly positive Chinese addition to Shigatse, outside of improved sanitation and public utilities, is its hospital, which some say is the best equipped and most capable in Tibet. Less than a mile from the center of town lies the Tashalunpo Monastery, historic seat of the Panchen Lamas and presently the largest active Gelugpa institution in Tibet. It was founded in 1447 by the first Dalai Lama, who is entombed in the monastery. Successive abbots of Tashalunpo traditionally bore the title of Panchen, meaning great scholar, an honorific which was elevated by the great fifth Dalai Lama, who proclaimed Tashalunpo's then-current abbot to be an incarnation of the Buddha of infinite light. Subsequent Panchen Lamas have been subordinate only to Dalai Lamas in power and standing. The 10th Panchen Lama died in 1989, and its current holder, the 11th, is the subject of a dispute between the Chinese, who've picked one of their own, and the Tibetans, whose selection was endorsed by the exiled Dalai Lama. Predictably, Tibet's nominee lives in a Chinese jail. Tashalunpo's walled-in complex contains an impressive array of buildings, most of which are visible from the entrance gate. Among the largest of these is the Chapel of Maitreya, commissioned in 1914 by the 9th Panchen Lama to house an 85-foot statue of Maitreya, otherwise known as the future Buddha. Its construction took 4 years and consumed 660 pounds of gold and more than 160 tons of brass and copper. Other buildings to the east of it contain tombs of all Panchen Lamas from the 4th through the 10th, along with numerous temples honoring Buddhas and other deities. The largest of these is the Jokhang Temple, actually a collection of buildings constructed around a large courtyard, which serves as a daily gathering place for monks and a focal point for monastic festivities. A walkway northeast of this complex leads to an enormous white wall from which a 130-foot-tall tanka is hung during a religious festival once a year in July. A terrace in front of this wall provides incomparable views of the monastery and surrounding town. Continuing westward from Shigatse, a line of vehicles stopped on the highway ahead signals our approach to another of the numerous police checkpoints interspersed along the roads of Tibet. Therein lies a tale. At first meeting, my guide Tenzin had led me to believe that he was our leader and that Zhang, our driver, was merely a peasant unable to understand or speak English. Nevertheless, as time went by, Tenzin seemed to defer to Zhang on matters of judgment, particularly regarding access to places off the beaten track or to those of a sensitive nature. At checkpoints, it was Zhang, not Tenzin, who presented our permits for examination, and I noticed that the police seemed curiously deferential to Zhang, suggesting perhaps that he was a member of Chinese intelligence. Over the several weeks of this trip, Tenzin recounted a litany of atrocities perpetrated by the Chinese on Tibetans, including members of his own family, which, if true, would almost certainly have precluded his becoming a guide, a position of honor bestowed by the Chinese only upon those faithful to the motherland. Furthermore, Tenzin's intense interest in my reactions to his tales of woe, coupled with Zhang's undisguised attentiveness during these revelations, belied Zhang's ostensible inability to understand English and led me to suspect some sort of imminent trap. In any event, nothing ever came of it, since after all, I'm here to tell a tale. The section of the Freedom Highway we now traverse is among its most difficult, crossing 3 rugged passes, one more than 17,000 feet high, on the way to our next destination, Shegar, 143 miles from Shigatse. Shegar's chief attribute is its proximity to a primitive road diverging south toward the Himalayas, where it terminates at the world's highest monastery, the Rangfu, perched on a glacial moraine at the foot of Mount Everest. We spend a night here, leaving at dawn for the 6-hour, 40-mile, bone-rattling journey to the world's highest mountain. This wild cross-country jeep track, more suitable for pack animals than vehicles, climbs rapidly into the mountains on steep switchbacks, traversing unstable terrain that frequently threatens to landslide. Our discomfort is assuaged, however, by the magnificent scenery, including this sweeping panorama of the Himalayas from the crest of the Pang La, a 17,000-foot pass. Spread out before us in an incredible array of grandeur are 5 of the world's 6 highest mountains, with the Black Pyramid of Everest commanding center stage. 18 miles west of Everest lies Cho Oyu, number 6 in the world, which you'll hear more about shortly. From here, our road descends to the valley, and our view of giant peaks is temporarily eclipsed by nearby hills. Eventually, an interminable series of switchbacks culminates in a bend in the road, and Everest dramatically reappears, this time less than 12 miles away. Soon, we reach the Rangfu Monastery, and I consume a roll of film photographing it against the backdrop of Everest's precipitous north face. The northern base camp of the world's highest peak is under a mile away across the glacial moraine, which, to my surprise, suddenly disgorges a lone mountain biker who waves to me as he passes by. After a brief lunch here and more photography, we commence our return to Shegar, with late afternoon shadows turning the landscape into a chiaroscuro of scenic majesty. In the morning, we continue westward on the Friendship Highway, and in less than 40 miles reach the little town of Dingri, which commands an excellent view of Cho Oyu, the world's 6th highest peak. Let's now for a moment backtrack 6 months to the previous spring, when I spent the night here as a member of an expedition led by my friend Rick Wilcox to climb Cho Oyu. This was the most serious mountaineering endeavor of my life, and my expectations were tempered by the knowledge that none of the world's 14 highest peaks had ever been climbed by anyone my age. Nevertheless, the challenge, while intimidating, was irresistible. Ours was an extremely experienced and competent group, and prior to arriving in Dingri, we had spent 3 weeks acclimatizing in Napal. So now we were ready to begin the 35-mile drive south to the base camp of Cho Oyu. This overland track resembles the one to Everest, ending at 16,500 feet elevation on the moraine of the Kayatrak Glacier, the site of Cho Oyu's northern base camp, where we'll spend 3 days acclimatizing. Our support staff of 75 Sherpas, porters, and yak drivers is led by Rick's ever-loyal Sirdar, Ergun Sherpa, and he directs preparations for the climb while I spend the time searching nearby hills for photo opportunities, finding, to my consternation, that a cold I picked up in Nepal has descended into my chest. We break camp on the 4th day and begin the 20-mile hike up the valley to Advanced Base Camp at 19,000 feet. Like most routes in the Himalayas, our track cuts across the grain of the land in an interminable series of ups and downs, making today's 3,000-foot climb seem double the amount. Advanced Base Camp is perched on the rock-strewn Kayatrak Glacier in a magical spot surrounded by the vast bulk of Cho Oyu to our east and formidable peaks bordering the 19,000-foot Nang Pala Pass to our west. Many of our porters entered Tibet over this dangerous pass, which is cross-cut by hundreds of hidden crevasses, requiring great care to traverse. While the scale of Himalayan topography exceeds that familiar to most of us, the picture before you conveys a sense of its enormity, depicting a caravan of 10 yaks and 20 drivers barely visible as they leave the glacier. Over the next 2 weeks, our high-altitude Sherpas are consumed with preparing and supplying camps higher on the mountain. As always, mountaineering efforts on great peaks are ruled by the weather, and as you can imagine from this picture with 150-mile-per-hour jet stream winds blasting snow from the 27,000-foot summit of Cho Oyu, much of our time is spent waiting for favorable conditions. Thin air weakens the body's recuperative powers, and I find that my chest cold has escalated into severe bronchitis, accompanied by fever and relentless paroxysms of coughing, which keep me awake night after night. One morning, I decided to follow our group on an acclimatization hike to Camp 1 at 21,000 feet, and succumb to paralyzing bouts of coughing so severe that our climbing doctor fears I may fracture ribs. After a week of this with no improvement, it's clear that my only option is descent, and I arranged for Ergun Sherpa to accompany me to base camp and evacuation by jeep to Dingri. Later on, I learned that all but one of the remaining clients bailed out the day after me, leaving only Rick, 2 guides, and 1 client to attempt the summit. Reaching Camp 3 at 25,000 feet a week later, they were buffeted by unrelenting 140-mile-per-hour winds, and after several days with no let-up and time running out, they too gave up. So now I find myself back in Dingri, where, the following fall, I'll again be passing through on my way to the Nepalese border. Jumping ahead then 6 months to where we left off, let's rejoin Tenzin and Zhang on our journey west across the Friendship Highway. Perhaps the most incredible portion of this consistently extraordinary road is the stretch between Dingri and the Nepalese border. After crossing 2 17,000-foot passes, from one of which we glimpse Shishapangma, the world's 14th highest peak, we plunge headlong into a spectacular gorge of unparalleled beauty. Pausing for refreshment at Nyalam, site of a military outpost, I witness another example of Chinese contempt for the people of this country. As a group of Tibetan adults and children surround me during lunch, I glimpse an army jeep descending at high speed from a side road. As it approaches us, the Tibetans scatter, but not before the jeep, heading deliberately towards them, barely averts contact before braking to a screeching halt. 4 military officers then emerge pompously from the jeep, thoroughly amused by their senseless act. Continuing our descent, vegetation abruptly reappears, the air thickens and the walls of the gorge steepen, contorting the highway into a tangle of hairpin curves. Monsoonal downpours during summer months turn the road we now descend into a quagmire of dangerous landslides, making it virtually impassable for weeks at a time. Before long, the border town of Zhangmu appears below us, clinging precariously to the mountainside with our highway zigzagging through it. We spend a night here in this wild and raucous place, notorious for its mile-long traffic jams and multiple discos which rock until dawn. In the morning, we join the long queue of people and vehicles awaiting passage through customs and immigration, an endless process exacerbated by bureaucratic inefficiency. Finally, we're through, and a waiting van on the other side carries us down the 5-mile stretch of no man's land to the Friendship Bridge and our return to Nepal. Halfway across this bridge, a painted line marks the boundary between Nepal and Tibet. As I cross it, a warm, fragrant breeze ascending from the plains of Nepal invigorates the stagnant air, and a sensation of exquisite relief overcomes me, as if the albatross of oppression had suddenly risen from my shoulders into the gentle wind of freedom. And now, spread out before me, more lovely than remembered, is a landscape resplendent with pastoral beauty, a colorful checkerboard of terraced fields nourished by an ample river, and dotted here and there with industrious Nepalese tending their crops. Later on, approaching Kathmandu, I'm amused by the deshabille of Nepalese architecture, with its crude buildings seemingly incomplete, as if awaiting some stroke of fortune to enable the addition of another floor. And finally, I encounter the noise, congestion, and activity of the city, once offensive, yet now, from a new perspective, so vibrant, so uninhibited, and so welcome after the torpor and regimentation of enslaved Tibet. I spend several days in Kathmandu, reacquainting myself with its many pleasures, and then, early one morning, leave for the Tribhuvan airport and my return to the United States. Our plane awaits us, and boarding it, I must admit to a pang of remorse for failing to schedule more time in this remarkable place. Soon we're aloft, ascending through layers of smog blanketing the gentle valley of Kathmandu, its verdant patchwork of planted fields and its scattered dwellings receding into the haze, blending into the terraced slopes of surrounding foothills wreathed here and there with mist, and then finally breaking out into clear air where, to our north, the mighty bulwark of the Himalaya rises majestically through encircling clouds, separating, as we have seen, two extraordinary countries worlds apart despite their proximity. Although the future of Nepal is clouded by widespread poverty, illiteracy, and political instability, the fate of Tibet seems to me more bleak. One wonders whether its people will ever again regain the freedom they once enjoyed to practice their peaceful way of life, where spiritual values play so vital a part. The recent history of this country is indeed a nightmare, born of a holocaust of death and religious desecration unequaled in modern times, and followed by an oppression which to this day is palpable. However, as the communists have come to realize the futility of their efforts to expunge spirituality from the Tibetan psyche, conditions have improved, but it remains to be seen whether the continued dilution of the original population and culture of this country by the organized immigration of Chinese may ultimately render Tibetan hopes for self-determination demographically irrelevant. The guiding light of the Dalai Lama in exile has sustained the Tibetan people through these troubling times and has aroused worldwide sentiment for their plight, prompting numerous overtures to elicit tangible support from the major powers. But alas, the waters of international politics run deep and dark, submerging man's nobler instincts in a sea of expediency where issues of trade and defense and concepts such as balance of power and mutual assured destruction compromise morality. And so I return once more to the modern world with its frenetic hustle and bustle, its obsession with material things, and its hysterical complexity. The recent advances in science and technology are among the hallmarks of our time, yet they've pampered us to the point of dependency. While I fully embrace this technology and could hardly imagine life without it, the ready smile and selfless generosity of the Sherpa, whose cheerful dispositions belie a precarious existence, suggests that we have much to learn about the roots of happiness and the sources of our discontent. There is indeed irony in the likelihood that these humble people owe their apparent contentment to a life of limited expectations, of narrow self-sufficiency, and of freedom from the materialistic distractions so important to us. Whatever the reasons, it's clear that they find happiness here in this land of great convolutions, this Himalayan Shangri-La whose siren call beckons me time and again to return and continue my quest for beauty and enlightenment on those shining pinnacles in the sky.